Yeah, thank you very much. Thank you for the introduction. Thank you for inviting me on this cold evening to London. That's global warming, obviously, what we are experiencing here. Indeed, as Gilbert said already, I will talk a bit about economics, unfortunately, I must say. That's the bad thing about this lecture. The good thing is I'm not talking about traditional economics, but alternative economics. So you will see that there are different approaches, and I think these different approaches are extremely important. The other bad thing about my lecture is that I'm mainly talking about industrialized countries, and even my own country, Germany, a bit. That has two reasons. One is that the data situation in many developing countries, unfortunately, and the unfortunately is with great emphasis, is not very good. So that for things that of the kind that I tried to show to you, it's very difficult to find data for developing countries or the region we are mainly here interested in, the Oriental and African region. There it is in particular very difficult to find reasonable data. But on the other hand, I think there is a core of economics that is universally applicable, and I try to talk a bit about what is universally applicable and what not, because there are several things that are not applicable at all. The other reason why I'm talking about industrialized countries and Germany is that Germany has gone through a unique experiment in the last 15 years. And I would like to quote today's Financial Times about this German experience, and then I'm going to discuss and analyze this experience a bit. So the Financial Times, as many newspapers all over the place, all over the globe, more or less every day say, for better or worse, many Germans feel that they were duped into supporting the euro, partly as a price for German unification within a unified Europe. They have justifiable pride in the success of Germany's own economic policy over the past 2 decades, first in absorbing the East German wreck and later restoring the whole country's competitiveness through far-reaching labor market reforms. Does it sound familiar to you, labor market reforms? That is what we are preaching, not we are, but some international institutions are preaching to the whole world, that you need labor market reforms, that you need flexibility of the labor market to be successful in today's world, in the globalized economy. This is the title of my presentation, namely, is it possible to have inclusion and participation in a world with flexible labor markets? And the answer will be no. But this is not bad, this is good. Because the only thing we have to do then, if the answer is no, the only thing we have to add is that we need a new economic theory. Not more, but not less than a new economic theory, at least a macroeconomic theory. So this is the topic of what I'm going to present tonight, and I very much hope that it's not too much economics for all of you, because you may not be economists and you may have only marginally been touched by economics in the past. But nevertheless, don't worry and don't be frustrated. It's not very difficult. The most important economic things are quite straightforward and understandable. So I very much hope that everybody can benefit from this lecture. So, first of all, what we are talking about in today's world is a very peculiar situation. And this is, again, the industrialized world. We have family income expectations in the industrialized world in the 3 big industrialized regions in this world: Japan, the Euro area, and the United States. And why am I starting with family income expectations? Well, because we have reached, for the first time, a level of family income expectations that means the expectation of an average family in these regions that is extremely negative for a very long time. And we have not only reached it in one region, but we have it in all the 3 regions. So if you take together the United States, the Euro area, and Japan, and you look at their overall GDP, you find a peculiar thing. Namely, you find that for these three regions, the famous exports, everybody's talking about exports and trade, exports do not count very much. They're only 8 or 9% of the overall GDP. Investment is very low, around 10%. So what is the bulk of the GDP of these three regions? Well, it's very simple, it's consumption. It's mainly private consumption. Private consumption accounts for something like 80%. And now if you look into the future of these three regions, you see this is up to January at least, not in January to October last year. So if you look into the future of these three regions, you find that we are in a very specific situation. Namely, in all these three regions that are waiting, so to say, for growth to come, that are waiting for new recovery to come in the next days, so to say, everybody's waiting is on the financial markets, everybody is waiting now for the final signal that the recovery is there. In these three regions, you find that for the most important component of global of production and income for private consumption, the signs are extremely bad. They're extremely bad. And why is that? Well, that is for a very simple reason. Take the United States. We had a slowdown, not a slowdown, but we had something close to a depression, a sharp recession in the United States in the course of the financial crisis in 2008. What happened during this financial crisis, recession? Well, as usual in these kind of recessions, unemployment went up. Unemployment went up in a country, and that is important to emphasize, in a country where wages have not risen for something like, well, 20 years or 30 years, depending a bit on the measure that you take, where the average real wage, the median real wage, has not risen for 30 years. So we have a situation in the United States where the income expectations have been bad already long before the crisis. Then came the crisis. The crisis increased unemployment. And what is the solution then? What is the way out? So now, if you look at neoclassical economics, which is still mainstream economics, which is the dominant part of economic theory all over the world in all other international institutions, with the one exception, or maybe the two exceptions of UNCTAD and ILO, well, you find that the very simple recipe for overcoming such a recessionary period in the United States, well, is flexibility of wages. But wages are extremely flexible already. And wages have never risen. That's the crucial point. Wages have never risen before. Going into the crisis was not a process that was accompanied by rising wages, but the other way around. It was a process that was accompanied by falling wages, the falling wage share. Nevertheless, unemployment rose. Though this simple fact alone shows that something is fundamentally flawed with the mainstream economic theory, because the mainstream economic theory would always only allow unemployment to rise when wages are rising more than justified. But wages have never risen and unemployment is high. So what happens now in the United States? Well, a very simple thing. The United States are trapped. They are trapped by high unemployment that puts enormous pressure on wages. If wages do not rise, consumption will not rise. If consumption will not rise, growth will never recover, at least as long as people keep their savings ratios constant. What you have seen in the last 2 quarters in the United States was, again, a dramatic reduction of savings ratios. So despite falling disposable income in the United States, we have an increase of consumption. But as the savings ratio is again down to 3% or something like that, that cannot last forever. So they are trapped in a so to say, self-made trap. They produce this trap by their claim to the labor market that the labor market should be flexible. And you see even in this extremely highly flexible US labor market, people are trying to so to say, push out the unions even more, although they are hardly existent in many areas. So what happened, this extremely flexible labor market leads into a situation where the United States cannot get out of the recovery anymore. And this is shown in the economic policy, so to say, desperation that you have there. You see, fiscal policy is anyway blocked for political considerations, but if you look at monetary policy has done something in the United States that every reasonable person would have called 3 years ago something like socialism or communism, because what has the Federal Reserve done, they have fixed the interest rate that they are asking from the banks for 3 years in advance. This is a planned economy. You see, there's no flexibility of prices anymore, no flexibility of the interest rate anymore. So they have explicitly, the Federal Reserve was hardly recognized in the rest of the world, unfortunately. But I was sitting close to Ben Bernanke in the last meetings of the IMF in autumn, and you could feel his desperation. You could feel his desperation about the situation because they did not know what to do anymore. So they fixed it for 3 years in last summer, but now they have even extended it to 4 years. 4 years absolutely fixed nominal short-term interest rates in the United States. This is the end of price flexibility. And the interesting thing is it's justified. It's justified. Because this is my main thesis here. What we are talking about, if we're talking about successful economies, if we're talking about successful development, then we have to talk about inflexible prices. Not about flexible prices, but inflexible prices. What we need is just the other way around than the mainstream economic theory teaches us. And we have to create an economy where prices, the main prices at least, the macroeconomic prices, are rather inflexible, but quantities are flexible. What the mainstream teaches us is that quantities are rather rigid, but prices should be flexible. So at least for the lower income part, the low skill part of the population, wages, so to say, never rise, so people can be happy if they get jobs by cutting their wages. That should be sufficient for any kind of progress. But it's not. And this shows quite clearly, in my view, that it cannot be. We have gone into this problem some time ago. I'm showing 2 or 3 charts from the Trade and Development Report 2010, where we have dealt with that question explicitly, the question of labor market flexibility in developed and developing countries, because the paradox is what we have seen in the last years, not years, but decades. We have seen falling wage shares in many countries of the world, despite the fact that unemployment rates are high and getting even higher. And the most recent paradox, as I've said, was after 2008. So, but the crucial analytical thing of this work that we have done in 2010 was, in my view, this chart. Unfortunately, I show it to you for developing countries, but as I said, the data are very poor for developing countries, but it's more or less the same. Only for the developed countries, the structure, the relationship, the correlation is much, much clearer because we have consistent data. This data shows something that is, so to say, breaks the neck of mainstream economic theory if you interpret it correctly. Because it shows that the mantra, the idea, the ideology that employment has nothing to do with growth is wrong. Because neoclassical economic employment theory would always say, well, it's not important whether you have 5% growth or 3% growth or no growth at all. There's always a wage rate. There's always a wage rate in this world if your prices are flexible enough at which you can have full employment. There's always a wage rate. So just go for flexibility of wages, flexibilize your labor market, get rid of the unions so that you have individual contracts at best, and then you are in the best of all worlds, then you will have no problems with unemployment anymore. This chart shows that it's plainly wrong. You have for all the big industrialized countries in this chart, I think we have G7, it was G7. For the big industrialized countries, you have the world is just the other way around. Namely, you need growth to stimulate employment. Even in the United States, this chart is absolutely clear and cannot be challenged. It's absolutely clear that you need growth to stimulate employment. So it's never is wage flexibility sufficient sufficient to stimulate growth and stimulate employment. It's just the other way around. If you have too much wage flexibility, you will get into the situation in which the United States are now, namely that through the falling wages, you do not get the stimulus of demand that you need, the stimulus from the workers' demand and from private households' demand that you need to get a growing economy and get catching up in developing countries. So this is extremely crucial to take note of, and it is supported by another very clear relationship that we find for developed economies this time, and for developing economies exactly the same, at least for a selection of developing economies where we have data. Namely, this chart shows that inflation, which is an important constraint for many developing countries, and has been the most important focus of economic policy in the so-called Washington Consensus times of the last 20, 30 years, that inflation is not a monetary phenomenon. That is, again, what every good economist believes, that inflation is a monetary phenomenon. That is what monetarism has taught us over the decades. Milton Friedman and others have taught us that inflation is a monetary phenomenon. It's always too much money, they said, too much money chasing too few goods. It's not true. It's not true at all. Money supply, or what they call money supply, there is no such thing as money supply. In no normal economy, there's something like money supply. It's a fiction. It's just an idea. It doesn't exist. Central banks fix interest rates and nothing else, so they do not steer in any way the money supply. That's one way to justify this monetary phenomenon of inflation, but it's not justifiable in principle. So there is no money supply. So it's not money that determines inflation, but it's wages. And wages in relation to productivity. This is what this chart shows, namely, wherever you go, you find that over every reasonable term, short term, medium term, long term, the inflation rate is determined by unit labor cost and more or less nothing else. In some countries, very open economies, you have some influence from imports and other things, but normally it's unit labor costs that determine inflation. But if unit labor costs determine inflation, then it's absolutely clear that the Keynesian idea holds, namely that you cannot, by cutting wages, you cannot even get the idea of the neoclassical theory going, namely that you cut nominal wages, and with the cut of nominal wages you get real wages to fall, and then when real wages fall, employment will rise. It's wrong on two sides. It's wrong on the side of say, 3-4 years, you get a reaction of inflation to wage cuts, which reduces, at least significantly, reduces the effect on real wages, so that real wages are less cut than nominal wages. But plus, as I said before, plus if you take the other effect that I mentioned before, this is the so-called Keynes effect. I allow you at the end to call the other effect the Flassbeck effect, that's okay. So the other effect is that if you have falling real wages, then you have immediately falling demand. And with this immediately falling demand, you never get the kind of effects that the neoclassical theory envisages, even if real wages fall. But over the medium term, we see that real wages do not fall, but the only thing that happens is that you get a lower rate of inflation. So these two elements are absolutely crucial. Namely, you have a clear relationship between growth and employment, as I've shown before. You have growth and employment clearly highly correlated, and you have unit labor cost and inflation highly correlated. If you put that together in a theory, you will see that nothing, more or less nothing of the neoclassical edifice remains. It will all collapse. It will all collapse and has to make place for a new theory. But why is it not happening? You may ask the question, so why is it not happening? If it's so evident that these relationships hold, why are people still talking about money and inflation? Well, for a simple reason, for ideological reason. Because and I fought the fight about this chart, about the relationship between unit labor cost and inflation in Germany for around 30, 40 years or so, something like that. The other side, so to say, what does the other side do? They do not talk about it, they just ignore it. They just ignore it. They ignore this relation and continue speaking about inflation as a monetary phenomenon, because they know once they would discuss that even, they would have to acknowledge that there is a strong correlation, that you cannot fight inflation by monetary policy, and that would mean that you kill your own ideological construct that you have built around you over the last 20, 30, 40 years, including all the nice gifts that you get from lobbyists of that part of the world. So one question remains then. Only one question remains in principle. I cannot go into all of the details of this, but one question remains. So how can then the German success in the European Monetary Union that I have mentioned be explained? This is the question of the Financial Times of yesterday. So why can a country that has done exactly what the neoclassical theory asked them to do, namely flexibilize their labor markets? You may remember, some people may remember that Germany 5 years ago was called the laggard, was the weakest country in the whole Eurozone. So how can such a country come like Phoenix out of the ashes and dominate the whole of Europe in a short period of something like 5 years? Well, the explanation is very simple. But the explanation is exactly the opposite of what people like the leader writer in the Financial Times believe. By the way, the only guy who gets it right in the Financial Times is Martin Wolf. It took him a long time, but now he gets it right, more or less. So at least he is able to learn. That's a good thing. So, but most of the others not. So what I want to demonstrate to you that my theory is absolutely right and the other theory is absolutely wrong by way of the German example. So this is the most critical example for my theoretical approach, namely my own country has done exactly what was asked for and is successful, whereas all the others are not. So here's the simple explanation for that. What happened, I'm comparing Germany with France, and you see what happened. Germany, after a short while into the European Monetary Union, had a quite strange development of the most important components of demand. Namely, external demand, which is exports here, exploded, so to say, whereas domestic demand remained absolutely flat. What does it mean? Well, that means, on the one hand, if you have flat domestic demand, that means it shows exactly what I said before. Namely, when you try to cut wages, and that is exactly what Germany did. Germany started to cut wages in the mid of the 90s. When I came to the government, I could interrupt it for a year or so, but then I was fired, and they went on with this kind of, vice ministers are fired. My minister left. He could say, I'm leaving, but I had to be fired. So they fired me, and then they could go on with this kind of policy. So what happened? They put an enormous pressure on the unions. They created what was called a tripartite agreement, where the union leaders even agreed that from now on Germany would go for the experiment of cutting wages or having real wages lagging very much behind productivity increase. So up to that point, Germany was really an economy where the real wages more or less followed productivity increase, which created a normal domestic demand. From that point on, it was dramatically changed, and you see domestic demand in Germany never recovered. So with the stagnation of real wages, and it was really an absolute stagnation of real wages, average real wages in Germany absolutely stagnated, we had an absolute stagnation of domestic demand. And that exactly proves my point. That exactly proves my point. Because if the neoclassical, say, the substitution effect of neoclassical economics would have been there, then even on the internal demand, you would never you would never see a reaction of domestic demand to the wage restraint, because the neoclassical theory says, and I had a long fight about this with the German extremely neoclassical Council of Economic Advisors a couple of years ago, and they argued, well, there can never be a negative demand effect of lagging wages behind productivity, because the negative effect of wages lagging behind productivity would always be fully compensated by the substitution effect, namely by more people being employed, and they would have the income, so per head, the income, the real wage would fall or would lag behind, but overall, the sum of real income would never fall and would never affect domestic demand. That's wrong. That's absolutely wrong. And this chart shows that it's wrong. I'll show you a chart in a minute where I have tried, well, just for sake of illustration, what would have happened with domestic demand in Germany if wages would have risen. But the other thing, what happened, there's another effect that is for sure there. You can go back to Keynes' famous, what was it, John Weeks knows better than me, what was chapter 19 or so in Keynes, the famous chapter about unemployment and wages. You can go back to that chapter, you can go back to Kalecki or whatever you want. You will always find that all intelligent Keynesians knew that if under certain external conditions one country cuts its nominal wages or its unit labor costs, has lower unit labor costs than the rest of the world, it will have, for a time being, at least a positive effect. And what is that positive effect? Well, that positive effect is an increasing competitiveness. You increase your competitiveness because what you create with your falling wages or your lower increase of unit labor costs, I'll show it in a minute, you create, so to say, a devaluation. You create a fall of what economists call the real exchange rate, which is a measure of competitiveness. And this happened now under the specific, particular conditions of the European Monetary Union. The particular conditions of the European Monetary Union were that there is no currency that could be devalued or revalued to compensate for such an advantage, an absolute advantage, which has nothing to do with comparative advantage or something like that, but could compensate for such an absolute advantage that one country is creating at the expense of its partners. There is no reaction to that, no way to react to that. And only, it is quite clear, only after a long time you will realize, the partners will realize, something has gone fundamentally wrong. And now here we are exactly there, namely that the partners have realized that something has gone fundamentally wrong. I come back to that in a minute. You see, there are two effects that have to be clearly separated. The one effect is the effect on external demand. If, under certain conditions, you do not have retaliation from your trading partners, you can beggar your neighbors by cutting wages. This will create, if nothing else happens, a positive effect for the time being, for a short time, for a medium term, depending on the monetary conditions and the overall exchange rate regime that you have. But on the internal side, on the domestic side, you will never have a positive effect. And this is true for the world as a whole. This is true for Japan, Euro area, and the United States together. There can never be a positive effect, a positive growth effect coming from a wage cut or from flexibilization of the labor market. That is an extremely important point to be made. So let me show you what would have happened if you make a very simple assumption, which is just a calculation exercise. You calculate that in Germany, instead of stagnative domestic demand, consumption would have followed, as in the past. That can be shown quite nicely. As in the past, consumption would have followed the increase of real wages, if there would have been an increase of real wages, and if wages would have followed the productivity increase of Germany. That is this red line. If the real wages would have followed the productivity increase and consumption would have followed the increase of real wages, overall, under the condition that the external trade surplus is not there, that external trade is absolutely balanced, we would have gotten in Germany such an increase of consumption. That would have been the consumption in Germany if we would not have had this real wages lagging behind productivity, but we would have had real wages rising exactly with productivity, so no distributive effect, but participation of the workers in the increase of productivity as before, so to say, a sharing of the overall income between capital and labor, a constant wage share. And then, if you compare this to France, you find exactly what France has done. France had this kind of policy. France had, I will show it in a minute, France had real wages following productivity, and this would have produced a consumption exactly like in France. You may ask, what would have that implied for overall growth? Well, again, under these very primitive assumptions, if you would have had higher consumption with a totally balanced trade, so no surplus in German trade, then growth, even under otherwise ceteris paribus conditions, would have been higher. Oh, now the PowerPoint. Oh, here we go. Sorry. Oh, this is one too far. Oh, now something is fundamentally wrong now with the PowerPoint. It's not working anymore. Too bad. No, I show you on this chart. At least you can see what I'm talking about. So what happened in EMU? The non-participative German economy went into competition with the other economies where the names have been changed. So look at the colors. Where Southern Europe is blue, France is green, and Germany is black. But there was a target. There was a target to be followed inside the European Monetary Union, and that was the inflation target. There was an explicit inflation target inside the European Monetary Union, and this inflation target was a target of 2%. This is the red line. So if you compare, and you look just to 2010, not up to 2022, that was planned to be different in my PowerPoint, but nevertheless. If you look at 2010, you see that there's a huge gap in the unit labor cost increase in Germany, Southern Europe, and in France. And this is the core of the problem of the European Monetary Union. This is the core. Forget about government deficits. They are a marginal problem. The core of the problem is that we have a divergence of inflation rates, a divergence of unit labor costs, and a huge gap in competitiveness. I do not want to go into the solution of this problem. I have painted here some charts to show how it could be solved. It can only be solved, only one word, can only be solved by dramatically changing the wage policy in Germany, by having much higher wages for a number of years, here in this example for 10 years, and a bit lower wages in the others, if the inflation target is not violated, This shows something extremely important now. I stop this because it's not working. Oh no, okay. This shows an extremely important point, namely that Germany, only under the extreme conditions of the monetary union, where there was no devaluation or revaluation possible, it could beggar its neighbors for some time. This is now over, as, so to say, Germany's clients have exploited their room of maneuver, their policy space to buy German goods. They are more or less bankrupt. So the German policy of cutting wages was insofar successful as Germany was able to produce the bankruptcy of most of its clients. This you could call successful or not. I would not call it a successful policy, because the bill will come, and the bill will be a huge bill, and it will be extremely expensive. Namely, Germany will have to correct fundamentally its whole economic policy approach. So instead of being successful by flexibilizing its labor market, it has done something that was, one could call foolish policies that were only possible under the unique historical circumstances of a monetary union. I want to mention another point. So my first point is flexibility of wages is wrong. What you need is very stable wages, and not wages as such, but what you need is stable participation of wage earners in the productivity progress in all economies of the world. That is extremely important because this is a stabilizing factor. This is for economic reasons, not for social reasons. I'm an economist, I'm not talking about social problems at all, but for economic reasons, this is absolutely indispensable to have inflexible wages in a way that wages follow the productivity growth, at least on the average. We can discuss what is below the average during the discussion. My second point that I want to make has to do with this chart. The second point is about interest rates. I mentioned already that in the United States, they have now fundamentally changed their policies about interest rates. They have fixed the interest rate at an extremely low level. And for sure, the level that they have fixed the policy interest rate in the United States is much lower than the expected growth rate. So the interest rate now is close to zero. Nobody would say that the United States are not expecting positive growth rate. They're expecting 2.5%. So they have applied a rule that was unfortunately never applied in most of the developing countries. I've given you some examples. We have looked very carefully into that, but the data situation is very, very bad. So we found some examples. But wherever you look, you find over prolonged periods in developing countries, you find that the interest rates are too high. To make it very blunt and simple, interest rates are too high. If you look at Africa, you have in Africa a number of countries, not only South Africa, but a country like Ghana, a country like Kenya, Uganda. John Weeks may have other examples in the discussion, where interest rates are all the time too high. So you have the funny situation that in many developing countries, you have wages that are stagnating or falling because they're following the flexibility proposal of the International Monetary Fund or the World Bank. But on the other hand, you have interest rates that are much too high. So interest rates that at least are much higher than anyone in the United States would accept them to be, following the old rule, you know, that don't do what we do, just do what we say. Please don't cut your interest rates down to a level as we have it, but just listen to our dogma that we try to sell to you. So this is extremely important, and if you compare this with the number of Asian countries, you see a dramatic difference. You see that in most of the Asian countries, the clearest example is China, but also in many, many other Asian countries, you had it just the other way around. In the Asian countries, at least up to the Asian crisis of '97, these countries were able to support the economy by extremely expansionary monetary conditions, in particular very low interest rates. So we have a squeezing of developing economies from two sides, from the wage side, where nothing happens, more or less, where meanwhile many countries have, so to say, given up to think even about participation of wage earners in the overall success. And this is particularly true if you look at the whole region of Northern Africa, where there was growth in the last 10 years, but it was not shared with workers. And that is why surely we see so much frustration there. But that has also made the economies of these countries extremely vulnerable because they were just dependent on exports and they never had a stable domestic demand. But the third point I want to make, without showing anything about that here, it's going a bit too far. We have a third extremely important price. We have a third extremely important price in this world, a macroeconomic price. We have wages, the wage rate, we have the interest rate, and we have the exchange rate. I do not want to go into that, but it can be shown again that here many developing countries have, so to say, a third squeezing factor, a factor that deprives them of getting into a normal development and to a catching up process. We have created a world, we have written extensively about that. If you look into our last Trade and Development Report, 2011, we have a long chapter about it. We have in 2009 a chapter about that. That is, so to say, my citerum censeo, since I'm an UNCTAD. We have created a world where developing countries systematically are threatened by overvaluation of the exchange rate. Because we have totally liberalized capital flows, and with this liberalization of capital flows, developing countries are easy targets for speculation with currencies, the so-called carry trade. I don't want to go into that, but that is a factor that is extremely important in many countries, even in small countries where you would not expect it. I just had a conference with ambassadors from smaller Latin American countries in Geneva this Monday, and they confirmed that all of these countries, there was not one country that would not be affected by speculation of hedge funds and other so-called banks, what we call nowadays banks, which is hedge fund in disguise, so to say, that are doing nothing else but to speculate in currencies and commodities. And so they are producing systematically for the one simple reason that sometimes, or most of the time, the inflation rates in the developing countries are a bit higher than in industrialized countries, and the interest rates are a bit higher than industrialized countries. They're producing systematic overvaluation of many countries, and so to say, put a third brake on the development success of developing countries. That brings me to the conclusion, and the conclusion is very simple. The conclusion is very simple and straightforward. As I said before, a new development model and a new economic policy model, and it applies really for developing countries as well as for developed economies. A new economic policy model has to have certain characteristics, but the most important one, it can be boiled down to one sentence, is that these macroeconomic prices have to be favorable for growth and have to be rather inflexible. So what you need is a wage rate that supports domestic demand by at least following productivity systematically over any kind of development process, including in commodity producing countries where the productivity progress very often is shown up in terms of trade gains. So in terms of trade gains is exactly the same as a productivity gain and should be distributed among the people in that country. Where second you have a pro-growth monetary policy that is stimulating investment in fixed capital, which needs in some countries, even in developing countries now, regulation of the financial market so that the people are not using the money that the central banks provide to go gambling in international casinos. So you have to have a monetary regime that favors growth in terms of having very low interest rates and having stable and low interest rates, and interest rates that are systematically below the expected growth rate, the growth rate that you can expect. And third, you need for the third macroeconomic price, the exchange rate, you need at least a slight undervaluation, or you need a justified valuation of the exchange rate. At least you have to avoid by all means an overvaluation of the exchange rate if you want to have a fair chance to avoid debt crisis and a permanent balance of payment threat on your economic policy. So the policy concept is just the other way around as the traditional one. The traditional one says you use monetary policy to stabilize prices. You use wages to stabilize the labor market, and the exchange rate you just leave to the market and they will find a reasonable value. That's all plain wrong, in my view. We need monetary policy to stimulate investment. We need wages to stimulate domestic demand, to stabilize domestic demand. and we need an exchange rate that helps to stabilize the external account. This is, sounds simple, but it's a revolution. Everybody who's fighting on these fronts and frontiers knows it's a revolution. We have up to this point, I've been sitting the whole last year in the G20, and believe me, we discussed 3 points. We discussed 3 points in the G20, just as an anecdote, as my last word. Coming from President Sarkozy, who really engaged very much at the beginning of last year in the G20 process, we discussed the global imbalances, we discussed commodity market financialization. I've not gone into that, but we have worked extensively on that, so we can discuss it. And we discussed a new global monetary order, including the volatility of short-term capital flows and exchange rates. In these whole discussions, my colleagues from other international institutions were never willing, and there were 6 institutions. There was the International Monetary Fund, the World Bank, the OECD, the BIS in Basel, and the so-called Financial Stability Board. From the other 5 international institutions, no one was ever willing even to discuss one of these pieces of evidence that we have presented, that we have contributed on the demand of the developing countries in the G20 group. But they ignored it. They ignored it from the very beginning. They ignored every piece of it. And just the best proof, so to say, is that in the whole discussion about commodity, the financialization of commodity markets, or speculation with commodities, in the whole discussion about short-term capital flow volatility and speculation with currency, in the whole year 2011, I was the only person ever from an international institution who would have used the word speculation. I was the only person ever who used the word speculation. From my colleagues from the International Monetary Fund, World Bank, and so on, no one would ever even use the word, because that does not exist. It does not exist because if it would exist, if they would acknowledge that there is this kind of evidence around, as I said, the whole edifice would collapse, and that has to be avoided at any price. Thank you very much.